It was on a Thursday, never a fortunate day for the Church of England, that the Reverend Edwin Collick, vicar of St. Botolph in Wood, was discovered quite dead in his own baptismal font. The discovery was made not by any member of the reverend gentleman's dwindling flock, but by one Wilfred Gurney, a lanky, discontented church organist with a pimpled complexion and a deep-seated grudge against the key of D major. Gurney had come early to practice Mendelssohn's War March of the Priests, which he declared was being performed at the Harvest Festival under protest. Upon entering the nave and noting a curious dampness about the chancel and a lack of response to his perfunctory "Morning, Vicar," he proceeded to investigate further, only to find the object of his half-hearted greeting floating face up among the lilies, soaked to the surplice. "Looks like he's gone and drowned himself," Gurney said later, with the tone of one noting a minor inconvenience. "Though what anyone wants with death in a bird bath, I don't know." By tea-time, the local inspector had arrived from Market Tetherby, a market town so dry it was said the Methodists were indistinguishable from the innkeepers. And by dinner-time, a letter had been dispatched to an old Cambridge friend, one Charles Parker, now of Scotland Yard. By breakfast the following morning, Parker had sent a telegram, reading only, "Whimsy in area, doing nothing particular, may be amused." And so it was that Lord Peter Death Braden Whimsy, DSO, came gliding into the sopping lanes of Witherfold-on-Lint like a moth in +4s, bearing with him a silver-tipped cane, a suitcase full of monogrammed shirts, and a faint air of having been misplaced by London society. "Oh, the country," he said, alighting from the Daimler, "where every shrub is guilty and every vicarage contains a theological conundrum, or in this case, a corpse." He paused upon sight of the church. Low, mossy, Norman, with a modest bell tower and the faintest whiff of mildew in its mortar. "Charming," he murmured, and sniffed, though the font has a suspiciously devotional aroma, rather like wet hymnals and spiritual despair. Superintendent Chivers, a stolid man with a moustache like a grieving badger, gave Whimsy the sort of look typically reserved for rooks that refuse to vacate the cricket pitch. "I suppose you'll want the details." "My lord," he said without enthusiasm. "The Reverend Collick was last seen at Evensong Wednesday. Nothing unusual. Found this morning by the organist, Gurney, though he says he's not seen the vicar since complaining about a misplaced C-sharp last Tuesday. No signs of violence, just drowned." "In the font?" "In the font." Whimsy removed a monocle from his breast pocket and affixed it with what could only be called ecclesiastical solemnity. He leaned over the font, which had been roped off with a curiously garish length of gingham ribbon, presumably the work of Mrs. Thistlethwaite, the verger's wife and an enthusiastic member of the Ladies' Harvest Committee. Whimsy examined the stone basin and the slightly rippling water within. A limp cassock sleeve floated like an ecclesiastical jellyfish, and one shoe protruded comically over the edge. "No sign of a struggle?" he asked lightly. "No broken lecterns, smashed chalices, or candles stuffed down the nave in a frenzy of post-Tractarian rage?" "Nothing of the sort. Clean as a confirmation class." "Curious," murmured Whimsy. "And how many grown men, Chivers, have you known to expire accidentally in their own font?" Chivers shifted. "Not many." "Nor I," said Whimsy. And he had, one presumes, been a vicar for some time. 27 years, widely liked, bit pedantic. "Pedantry rarely results in spontaneous immersion," said Whimsy, thoughtfully removing a damp square of paper from the stone rim of the font. He held it gingerly, for the ink was spreading like remorse. "A note?" Chivers asked, peering over his shoulder. Whimsy tilted his head. "Yes. Waterlogged. Rather a shame. Still legible in parts. Looks to be written in violet ink. Ghastly habit. Very theological." "Ah, here we are." He read aloud in tones as dry as communion wafers left out too long. "Cannot bear the sound any longer. Constant tolling. Not natural. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Is there a bell tower? There is, Chivers said, but no one's rung it in a fortnight. Rope snapped, under repair. Well, well, said Whimsy, folding the soggy note with exquisite delicacy. Then I do believe the good Reverend was hearing things. Delirium, Chivers offered. Whimsy gave him a look of polite agony. My dear man, if every cleric suffering theological fatigue were to throw himself into baptismal fonts at the sound of imaginary bells, the Anglican Church would be down 6 bishops a month. He straightened, hands in pockets. No, Chivers. I'm afraid there's something afoot, and it's not just the foot currently submerged in holy water. Whimsy stood a moment longer beside the font, gazing down at the drowned vicar with the expression of a man contemplating a baffling but faintly amusing crossword. The little church was very quiet. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, brass polish, and geraniums, the sort one never buys, but always finds lurking in window sills and gilt-ridden church arrangements. He turned at last and addressed Superintendent Chivers in a manner that suggested geniality, just barely concealing mischief. I should like to see the vicarage, he said, and speak to whoever last saw our late parson alive. Clergy don't often die in fonts without someone noticing they were, at the very least, in the bath. Chivers sighed through his moustache. His housekeeper's waiting. She's a formidable type. Served him these 20 years. Took the news hard, but not hysterical. One of the old sort. Whimsy nodded. Capital. The old sort are generally the best for murder. They possess a noble sense of proportion. They dust around the corpse, not over it. Together they crossed the gravel path that connected the modest church to its equally modest vicarage. A grey brick house of uncertain date and unambiguous dampness. Its roof hunched like an old lady's shoulders. A black cat lay sprawled on the garden wall, flicking its tail and looking unpleasantly pleased. They were met at the door by a beetroot-faced woman in an immaculately laundered apron, her expression composed in a tight, Calvinistic neutrality. Whimsy greeted her as one greets royalty or extremely prickly aunts. Mrs. Cattermole, I presume. I'm Lord Peter Whimsy. I understand you were the Reverend Collick's housekeeper. 22 years come St. Bartholomew's Day, she said in a voice that had scrubbed more than floors. Indeed. My condolences. I hope you can bear with us a little. These early questions are always tedious, but so frightfully useful when trying to avoid galloping down the garden path. She stepped aside stiffly. I'll show you into the parlour. I've laid out tea, but it's gone cold. Didn't seem right to refresh it. The parlour was as one might expect, all antimacassars, imitation Chippendale, and the faint aroma of disapproval. On the tea tray sat a pot, like a squat bishop, and a plate of sad-looking macaroons. Whimsy declined both and took a seat by the hearth, crossing one leg over the other with the air of a man settling into a favourite armchair in the middle of a thunderstorm. Mrs. Cattermole, he said gently, can you tell me when you last saw Mr. Collick alive? Last night. He took his supper here, as usual. Haddock boiled, a small salad. He read from the Church Times while eating, then retired to his study. I cleared the tray about 9:30, and nothing unusual in his behaviour. She hesitated a moment. Only he seemed distracted. Quiet, like not troubled. No more than usual, but not quite present. He asked me if I'd heard anything strange of late. Strange? Ringing. Bells. I said no, and he just nodded and went on reading. But it put me in mind. She broke off. Whimsy leaned forward slightly. Yes. It's silly, she said, flushing, but I'd heard something the night before. Not bells exactly. A kind of tolling, but distant. Faint, like when the wind carries sound from the valley. I thought it might be a farm gate. Could anyone else have heard it? I doubt it. The curate's half-deaf and always has the wireless on, and the vicar, well, he said nothing more about it. I'd not even mentioned it till now. Didn't seem important. Whimsy looked thoughtful. The vicar had no history of mental disturbance? Good heavens, no. Steady as a plumb line even when the choir defected to the Methodists. And he received any letters, visitors, an upsetting sermon in the Guardian. She shook her head. Only a letter yesterday morning, now I think of it. Pale blue envelope. I set it on his tray and it was gone by the time I cleared up. Can't say what became of it. Pity, Whimsy murmured. Might have been from one of those anonymous doctrinal fanatics. You'd be surprised how many people are prepared to kill over a comma in the Nicene Creed. At that moment, the door opened, and a pale, narrow figure in a black suit entered the room as if it had wandered in by mistake. It proved to be the curate, a man of such remarkable dithering that one feared he might apologize to a doorknob. Apologies. Mrs. Cattermole said I might. Mr. Lelliston, Chivers prompted. Yes, quite. Richard Lelliston. Curate, that is, I was. Whimsy stood and extended a hand. Delighted. Lord Peter Whimsy, you've had a trying morning, I fear. Lelliston clasped his hand limply. It's all very distressing. We're praying, of course. I suppose one supposes. Well, if he was unwell. We're not supposing anything yet, said Whimsy. But tell me, did the vicar mention anything to you of late? Bells, noises, dreams, perhaps? The curate flushed. Dreams. Well, not as such. But he was rather preoccupied the last few weeks. Kept asking about local history. Unusual for him. He said he wanted to know if the church had ever had, problems. What sort of problems? Spiritual ones. He was vague. Mentioned a bell that used to toll before the Reformation. Something called the ghost bell, I think he said. Seemed to think it had been heard again. Whimsy's eyes glittered. How delightfully Gothic. And did he seem frightened? More unsettled, as if he were trying to explain something he didn't understand himself. He was reading old parish records, muttering about acoustics. He even borrowed a book on campanology. Did he? Yes, from the library at Market Tetherby. I fetched it for him. Whimsy made a note. And where were you last night? At home. I live in the lodge by the Lich Gate. Had my supper, listened to the 9 o'clock service on the wireless, then went to bed. And heard nothing? Nothing unusual. Whimsy studied him a moment, then turned back to Mrs. Cattermole. You mentioned the letter. Are any of his belongings missing? A diary, perhaps? She pursed her lips. His brown hat's gone. His hat? The one he always wore walking. I thought it odd. It's not in the hall, nor the study, and he wouldn't go out without it. Vicar's like a kettle. They've their proper lid. Whimsy stood, brushing imaginary dust from his knee. A missing hat, a tolling that cannot be heard, and a corpse in the font. I think Chivers. We shall need to consult the organist next. Chivers looked unimpressed. That lanky fellow. You'll not get much sense from him. Whimsy smiled faintly. Sense, no. But perhaps something more valuable. Folly. Fools see angels in curtain folds and murderers in every pew. It's a start. As they stepped back into the sodden churchyard, Whimsy paused, glanced back at the vicarage, and murmured almost to himself, ringing without bells, a hat without a head, and violet ink. It's either nonsense or the opening bars of a very fine fugue. The cat, watching from the wall, blinked once, slowly. Then it yawned and turned its back. They found Wilfred Gurney in the vestry, hunched over a battered copy of the hymnal, muttering furiously to himself in a tenor that threatened to shatter stained glass. His complexion had deepened from discontent to a sort of sulky rouge, his spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his nose. Ah, Mr. Gurney, Whimsy said with a bow that was more theatrical than sincere. A singularly unmusical morning, I trust. Gurney looked up, eyes blinking behind thick lenses. It's all gone to pieces, he said flatly. No vicar, no service, no organist willing to play without proper notes. And now the bell rope's gone and snapped. The lamentable state of ecclesiastical affairs. Whimsy agreed. Might one ask about the bell? Your impression of the sound the Reverend Colic complained of? Gurney blinked. Well, it wasn't a bell, not really. More a tolling, like from the church at Market Tetherby, only fainter and persistent. Started around 10 days ago. He said it was driving him mad. Persistent, you say? Was the rope snapped at that time? Not then. The rope snapped last week. They said it would be repaired within days. Whimsy tapped his cane thoughtfully. And did you, by any chance, notice any discrepancy in the timing of the tolling? Hours when it ceased or grew louder? Gurney hesitated, shuffling papers nervously. No, it was constant. Never quite regular, but always there. At least I heard it faintly in the vestry. The curate had joined them now, his expression sheepish. It's true. I heard it too, when the wireless was off. Most unsettling. Whimsy raised a finger. Tell me, Mr. Gurney, have you had any recent visitors? Any newcomers to Witherfold? Only the usual. Miss Marple, who insists on playing Bach, and old Mrs. Thornberry from the village. Miss Marple, Whimsy said slowly. A pianist. Yes. She practices in the afternoons at the vicarage. Whimsy gave a nod. That may prove significant. The late Reverend appeared to be studying old parish records. Did you know this? Not in detail. But he did talk about the ghost bell in hushed tones. Said it was some superstition. A superstition, Whimsy echoed dryly. Yet one that caused the vicar to lose his peace of mind. They moved to the vicarage study, a cramped room heavy with leather bound, tomes and the faint scent of pipe tobacco. On the desk lay a small pile of papers, scattered and damp, as though the deceased had been wrestling with them in his final hours. Among them, Whimsy spotted the unmistakable book from the Market Tetherby Library. The Campanology of the British Isles, its pages dog-eared and marked with slips of paper. May I? Whimsy asked, picking it up. The curate nodded. He was fascinated by the history of bells in this region. Opening the book, Whimsy traced a finger over an illustration of a bell tower, its rope and pulley system carefully detailed. A handwritten note stuck between the pages caught his eye. The ghost bell tolls, but has no clapper, once rung to summon the faithful, now only to herald death. Whimsy's lips twitched. How wonderfully Gothic. Yet plainly nonsense, Chivers said bluntly. Not nonsense, my dear Chivers, but allegory, and possibly a metaphor for something quite mortal. Mrs. Cattermole's voice, brisk as a whipping wind, cut in from the doorway. If you'll excuse me, Lord Peter, the vicar's desk was always tidy. Those papers, it looks as if someone has been rifling through them recently. Whimsy studied the scattered sheets, noting ink smudges and a peculiar purple stain that spread across one corner. Ah, the infamous violet ink, he mused. Used by the vicar to write a note just before his demise, no doubt. But to whom? The question hung in the air as the clock in the hall struck 11, a sound at odds with the stillness, its tone somewhat muffled, yet insistent. Chivers frowned. That clock is 15 minutes slow. It's been that way for weeks. A misaligned clock, Whimsy said. How very symbolic. Symbolism won't solve a murder, Chivers grunted. No, Whimsy admitted. But the facts might. His gaze swept the room and came to rest on a small, slightly ajar window. The curtains, thick and brocade, hung unevenly, as if disturbed recently. Who last entered here? Whimsy asked. The vicar, of course, Mrs. Cattermole replied. And when? Whimsy pressed. After supper. He took his tea-hour, then retired to bed. Alone? No one else was in the house. Whimsy nodded slowly. Yet a window left open. Curious. The evening was cold and damp, as we know. Could it have been left so to admit a visitor? Or to admit sound? The curate wrung his hands. But who would come to disturb the vicar? Indeed, Whimsy said, tapping his cane. "Let us consider the missing hat. You said it was never worn inside?" "Never," Mrs. Catamole said sharply. "He'd never leave the house without it." "And yet it vanished after his death." Chivers grunted. "The obvious guess is theft. But why?" "Or concealment," Whimsy suggested. "Perhaps the hat bore a clue. A letter tucked inside, perhaps." "Or a mark," said Gurney. The vicar was particular about his hats. He'd not tolerate a stain or crease. Whimsy smiled thinly. "A mark, yes. A sign for those in the know. Secret societies, parish factions, the usual quaint madness of rural England." He paused, then asked, "Have any of you noticed anything else out of place? Missing objects, changed habits, strange visitors?" Gurney hesitated. "Well, now you mention it, the church silver salver was absent last night. It's usually on the sideboard in the vestry." "Uh-huh," Whimsy said softly. "The missing salver and the missing hat. Both small items, but possibly significant." The curate looked distressed. "The silver salver was used only for special occasions. Why take it now?" "Perhaps to mislead," Whimsy said, "or as a token for a rendezvous." They moved to the vestry, where Whimsy inspected the sideboard, noting a faint ring where the salver should have rested. The wood was warm and polished, but the smell of recent handling lingered. "Someone came here after the vicar was last seen," Whimsy concluded, "and perhaps waited." The organist's eyes darted nervously. "I was there last night, rehearsing after the lights went out. Heard voices in the village, too. Something about a meeting at the old mill." "The old mill?" Whimsy echoed. "Still standing?" "A ruin, mostly. But some say it's haunted." Whimsy's smile was dry as dust. "Of course it is." They left the church behind as the sky turned a bruised purple, the clouds heavy with unshed rain. The puzzle had begun to coalesce, a mosaic of minor oddities: a missing hat, a silenced bell, a ghostly tolling, a vanished salver, and a vicar disturbed by sounds none else heard. "Chivers," Whimsy said as they walked back towards the vicarage, "I suspect our good Reverend's death was not the unfortunate accident it appears. There is a pattern here, faint but unmistakable, woven through the humdrum of village life." Chivers grunted. "And what pattern would that be, my lord?" Whimsy looked up at the gathering dusk, the branches silhouetted like crooked fingers against the sky. "A pattern of secrets," he said, "and of silence broken not by bells, but by men." The night settled upon Witherfold-on-Lint like a shroud, and somewhere, just beyond the veil of reason, the faint echo of a bell tolled, though no rope stirred and no clapper rang. And Lord Peter Whimsy, with a glint in his eye and a cane tucked neatly under his arm, was already beginning to see the first faint outlines of a dark design. The evening deepened as Whimsy and Chivers made their way back to the vicarage, the air heavy with a dampness that seemed to settle not only on their coats but in their thoughts. The village of Witherfold-on-Lint, which in daylight had worn the quaint and orderly mask of a rural idyll, now seemed shadowed with an uneasy silence, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Inside the vicarage parlour, the faint tick of a clock competed with the crackle of the fire, its warmth a slight comfort against the chill seeping from the windows. Mrs. Catamole, her apron somewhat askew after a day of subdued activity, had reappeared with fresh tea, though Whimsy accepted only a thin slice of lemon cake, which he nibbled delicately. "Mrs. Catamole," Whimsy began with his customary archness, "you have served the late Reverend for over 2 decades. I dare say you know more of him than even he might have confessed. Is there, perhaps, a visitor, one who comes unbidden, a shadow across the hearth, a whispered word in the night?" The housekeeper's gaze was steady, though her hands tightened around the teacup. The Reverend was a solitary man, Lord Peter. His closest companion was his books, and sometimes the organist, when music was required. No shadows crossed this hearth without my knowledge. Yet shadows fall, even in well-ordered rooms. Whimsy mused. "Tell me, has the vicar ever mentioned disagreements within the parish? Disputes over pew rents, charity funds, or perhaps the churchyard?" Mrs. Cattermole hesitated. There was a small dispute about the Lich Gate repairs. The villagers could not agree on the style. The vicar wished for something old-fashioned, but the parish council wanted a modern design. It caused some friction, but nothing more. "Friction is often the spark," Whimsy said softly. "And what of Miss Marple, the pianist you mentioned earlier?" "She's a recent arrival," Mrs. Cattermole explained. "Lives in the cottage by the green. She practices daily and has taken an interest in the old hymns. The Reverend admired her skill, though he found her modern tastes a bit unsettling." "Modern tastes?" Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "She prefers Bach with a certain intensity. Some in the village say she's too passionate, as if trying to awaken something long dead." A slight smile played on Whimsy's lips, but it was tinged with something darker. "Passion can be a fine thing, Mrs. Cattermole, but sometimes it stirs more than just the keys of a harpsichord." The door opened with a creak, and in stepped the curate, looking even more unsettled than before. I thought you might like to see this," he stammered, producing a small folded sheet of paper from his breast pocket. Whimsy took it gingerly and unfolded the note. The handwriting was precise, almost meticulous, in violet ink, the very same shade found smudged on the vicar's desk. "Do not trust the bells. The past tolls louder than the present." Chivers grunted. Cryptic and ominous. Whimsy's eyes flickered. A message from the vicar, perhaps, or a warning left in haste. Could it be a threat? Mrs. Cattermole whispered. Or a confession, Whimsy suggested. The vicar was preoccupied with something ancient, something buried beneath the surface of this quiet parish. He turned to the curate. "Mr. Lelliston, when exactly did you last see Reverend Colic alive?" The curate swallowed hard. "Last evening, after supper. He was in his study, reading. I retired to my quarters shortly after." "Did you hear anything unusual during the night? Voices? Bells? Movement?" "No, nothing." The house was silent. "But I did notice this morning that the vicar's walking stick was not in its usual place." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Another missing item, the hat, the salver, and now the walking stick. "Perhaps they are tokens of an argument, a struggle," Chivers mused. "Or distractions," Whimsy said thoughtfully. "Items taken to mislead or to hide some other truth." His eyes drifted to the window again, still slightly ajar, the curtains disturbed as if recently brushed aside. "Is the window ever left open at night?" he asked. Mrs. Cattermole shook her head. "Never in this weather. The vicar was particular about his comfort." "Then it was opened after he retired, or by someone else." The curate looked pale. "But who would enter the vicarage at such an hour?" Whimsy tapped his cane. "That is the question, Mr. Lelliston. And who would want to unsettle the Reverend enough to drive him to study old superstitions and write cryptic notes in violet ink?" The silence hung heavily between them, broken only by the faint crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. "Perhaps," Whimsy said at last, "we would do well to visit Miss Marple. Passionate pianists often know more about their neighbors than they admit." The next morning was bleak and grey, the kind of day that seemed to press down on the soul. Whimsy and Chivers found the pianist's cottage on the village green, its neat garden a riot of early spring blossoms, oddly cheerful against the somber sky. Miss Marple answered the door with a cool, appraising glance, her dark eyes sharp beneath carefully arched brows. She was tall and willowy, dressed in black with a hint of silver at her temples. An older woman who seemed more accustomed to commanding a salon than a village cottage. "Lord Peter Whimsy," he said with a bow, "and Superintendent Chivers. We come with questions about Reverend Colic." She gestured them inside with a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. The cottage was filled with sheet music, old and new, and the air smelled faintly of incense and dust. "I knew the Reverend," she said smoothly, "a man troubled by shadows, both real and imagined." "Did you notice anything unusual lately?" Whimsy asked. "Unusual?" She tapped a slender finger against her chin. "The Reverend was obsessed with the ghost bell, a superstition really, but it clearly disturbed him. He believed it was heard again, tolling in the night. Did you hear it yourself?" She nodded. "Yes, the bell tolling with no bell. A sound that echoes but has no source. It unsettles the village, but none will speak of it openly." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Most inconvenient mystery." She shrugged. "Music is full of mysteries, sounds that haunt the spaces between notes. Perhaps the Reverend sought to explain a dissonance not in the bells, but in the lives around him." "Did you see him after supper last night?" "Number I was practicing here until 10. I would have heard if he came by." "Did the Reverend confide in you? Speak of threats, enemies, or secrets?" Miss Marple's smile deepened, almost wistful. "Secrets are the currency of a quiet village, but no one trusts secrets more than those who keep them." Whimsy stood, sensing the conversation had reached its limit. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your candor is appreciated." Outside, Chivers muttered, "I don't like her." Too many veiled words. "Veils are what hide the truth," Whimsy said softly, "and the truth is what we seek." As they walked back through the village, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift and realign, disparate notes in a discordant melody, the missing hat, the silent bell, the violet ink note, the open window, and now a pianist who spoke in riddles. Whimsy lit a cigar, the smoke curling upward as he considered their next steps. Somewhere beneath the veneer of polite civility, something dark and deliberate had taken root. It was up to him to untangle the web before the final toll sounded. "Tomorrow," he said to Chivers, "we visit the old mill. If whispers of midnight meetings are true, that is where the heart of this mystery beats." Chivers groaned. "Midnight meetings at a ruin? Sounds like a fairy tale." "Perhaps," Whimsy replied, "but every fairy tale has its kernel of truth, sometimes buried deep and covered in nettles." And with that, they parted for the evening, each haunted by the echo of a bell that tolled without a bell, and a murder that refused to lie quietly in the font. The following morning found Witherfold on lint, cloaked in a thick, damp mist that blurred the edges of the village green and softened the outlines of the crumbling mill on the outskirts. Whimsy and Chivers made their way along the muddy path, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, a reminder that beneath the veneer of genteel rurality lay the remnants of forgotten industry and unspoken histories. As they approached the mill, its skeletal timbers and moss-covered stones loomed like a monument to some bygone era, weathered but obstinate. Whimsy surveyed the ruin with a measured eye, noting the ivy crawling up the side and the shattered panes that allowed the pale daylight to spill unevenly across the dusty floor. "This place," Whimsy remarked, "appears less a mill and more a stage for secrets long past. Yet it still breathes, does it not?" Chivers grunted, eyeing the ruin with suspicion. "I doubt it has breathed since the last miller left town. What makes you think it's more than a relic?" Whimsy's gaze lingered on the faint tracks in the soft earth, footprints muddied but fresh. "These prints speak of visitors, and perhaps meetings. I wonder if they coincide with the tolling bell of which Miss Marple spoke." They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. A faint echo rippled through the hollow space, as if the stones themselves remembered the rhythm of grinding wheels and falling grain. Yet something else lingered, an unsettled silence, taut as a drawn bowstring. "Chivers," Whimsy said, "note the condition of these boards near the north wall." Chivers knelt, brushing aside the dust to reveal faint scratch marks. "Looks like someone tried to dig or lever something loose." Indeed. An attempt to disturb the foundations, perhaps, or retrieve what was hidden beneath. And given the mill's proximity to the churchyard, I suspect it relates to the ancient ghost bell legend. Whimsy produced his notebook, sketching a quick map of the site, marking where the scratches appeared and noting a faint discoloration on the stone wall nearby. Now, if the bell tolls without a bell, it might be sound carried through unconventional means. Hollow spaces, reverberations through stone, or, more intriguingly, an engineered echo designed to unnerve. Chivers frowned. Sounds like a ghost story, Lord Peter. Precisely, my dear Chivers, and ghosts, as we well know, are often the scaffolding upon which human treachery is built. They examined the walls, and Whimsy found a loose brick concealed beneath ivy. With some effort, he extracted it to reveal a small cavity behind, a hollow space containing a folded, yellowed piece of parchment. Unfolding it carefully, Whimsy read aloud, "The bell tolls for the sins of the fathers. Truth buried beneath the stone must be unearthed by those who dare." A cryptic note indeed, Whimsy observed, and one that implies knowledge of some long-concealed secret. Or a threat, Chivers muttered. What sins do they mean, and who might the fathers be? Perhaps the old Millers or the founding families of Witherfold, Whimsy replied. I think it behooves us to consult the parish records. Later that day, the two men found themselves ensconced in the dim, dust-laden vestry of the church, poring over brittle ledgers and faded documents. Whimsy's fingers traced the names of the village's forebears, noting peculiar entries and anomalies. Here, Whimsy said, tapping a ledger. The Millward family appears prominently for over 2 centuries, but their line seems to have abruptly ended in the 1890s. Tragedy? Illness? No cause is given. Chivers peered over his shoulder. It says disappearance here. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. A disappearance, you say? And in this same ledger, the land was sold swiftly to a new owner, one Thomas Collick, a distant relative of our late Reverend, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Chivers confirmed. That's the vicar's family name. So the Reverend's lineage is entwined with the old mill and, by extension, the secret hinted at in the note. Whimsy paused thoughtfully. The plot thickens, Chivers. It would seem the vicar was delving into his ancestral past, uncovering truths best left buried. Their investigation took a curious turn when they discovered an old map tucked away in the vestry, showing a series of tunnels connecting the mill to the church crypt, a fact long forgotten and absent from recent records. Subterranean passages, Whimsy murmured, most certainly used in the days of clandestine meetings or smuggling, possibly the channel through which the bell's ghostly toll is projected. That evening, as the vicarage clock chimed 8, Whimsy convened with the curate and Mrs. Cattermole, sharing their findings and outlining their suspicions. The room was thick with unspoken questions and guarded glances. The tunnels might explain the mysterious bell, Whimsy concluded, but they also open avenues for unseen movement, entries and exits in the dead of night that no one would notice. Mrs. Cattermole gasped softly. Could someone have used them to commit the murder? To enter and leave unseen? Exactly, Whimsy said, which brings us back to our elusive question, who had the knowledge and the motive to employ such a method? The curate, his brow furrowed, interjected, but the Reverend was well respected. Who would wish him harm? A man's virtues can be his undoing, Mr. Lelliston, Whimsy replied gently, especially when his virtues threaten another's comfort or conceal a deeper grievance. As the candlelight flickered, casting long shadows upon the walls, Whimsy's thoughts returned to the violet ink note, the vanished items, and the enigmatic pianist. The question remains, Whimsy said. Why did the vicar obsess over the ghost bell? Was it merely superstition, or did it mask a more tangible threat? Chivers shook his head. One thing's for sure, this case is anything but straightforward. Whimsy smiled thinly, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "No, Chivers, it is precisely the labyrinth of shadows we must navigate. The truth is a bell that tolls not for the dead, but for the living, and before its echo fades, we shall ensure it is heard clearly." With the day's discoveries setting a fresh cadence to their inquiries, the path ahead promised further revelations, each ringing louder than the last in the silent halls of Witherfield-on-Lint. The days that followed were marked by a quiet intensity. Witherfield-on-Lint settled into an uneasy rhythm, as if the village itself awaited the unraveling of some dark thread woven deep into its past. Whimsy, with his habitual flair for blending precision and patience, resumed his inquiries with renewed purpose. Chivers, less enthused but equally steadfast, shadowed his lordship's movements with a growing sense of reluctant admiration. Their first order of business was to explore the subterranean passages revealed in the ancient map, for nothing remained more tantalizingly obscure than the labyrinth beneath the village, a physical metaphor, perhaps, for the tangled secrets they were attempting to expose. Whimsy secured permission from the parish council, presenting himself with all the necessary civility to assuage their suspicions, and accompanied by Chivers and a local constable, they descended one damp afternoon through a narrow hatch concealed beneath the church floorboards. The air underground was thick and chill, smelling of mold and the earth's forgotten breath. The stone corridors were narrow and irregular, their walls worn smooth by centuries of disuse. Flickering lanterns cast dancing shadows that seemed to animate the very stones themselves. "Remarkable," Whimsy murmured. "This must have been a clandestine thoroughfare, perhaps for priests during the Reformation, or less pious travelers seeking refuge or concealment." Chivers muttered something about rats and the general unpleasantness of the place, but pressed on nonetheless. At intervals, the passages opened into larger chambers, some used for storage, others evidently as meeting rooms, their vaulted ceilings still bearing faint carvings, worn nearly to oblivion. The echoes of whispered conversations long silenced seemed to cling stubbornly to the walls. As they approached the junction near the old mill foundations, Whimsy stopped abruptly. "Observe the floor here," he said, kneeling to examine a patch of recently disturbed earth. "Fresh footprints and signs of scraping." He traced a line with his gloved finger. "Someone has been here quite recently, perhaps in the last few days." The constable nodded. "We searched the mill thoroughly, but found nothing unusual." "Not above ground," Whimsy replied, "but the secret lies here below." They continued, following the twisting passage until it opened into a cavernous chamber beneath the mill's remains. The air was damp and stale. A faint, almost imperceptible draught whispered through the tunnels. Near one wall lay a small pile of discarded cloth, fragments of what looked like a cloak or heavy coat, and a tarnished metal object, a locket, its clasp slightly ajar. Whimsy carefully picked it up, holding it to the light. "It bears an engraving," he said, turning it over. "A crest, 2 lions rampant, entwined with a willow tree." Chivers squinted. Could that be a family crest? "Most likely," Whimsy confirmed, "and a significant clue. The mill wards, no doubt." This discovery deepened the mystery. The locket, apparently lost or abandoned, suggested that someone with knowledge or connection to the old family had been clandestinely visiting the mill, perhaps searching for something, or hiding something themselves. Back above ground, as they emerged from the subterranean gloom, the vicarage bell tolled mournfully in the fading light, a slow and sonorous sound that reverberated oddly through the village. Whimsy's thoughts returned to the note, the ghost bell that tolls for sins buried beneath stone. That evening, in the vicarage parlor, Whimsy methodically pieced together the timeline and interviews collected thus far. The curate, Mr. Lelliston, had provided more details. Reverend Collick's recent fascination with family history, his private sessions with Miss Marple, and his growing unease as certain villagers had become reticent or hostile. Whimsy's arch tone masked the sharpness of his intellect as he observed. One finds that in small communities, the past does not rest quietly, but often insists upon its presence with a persistence that unsettles the present. Mrs. Cattermole's expression betrayed a flicker of something like dread as she nodded. "Aye, my lord, and secrets have a way of leaking out, like water through old stone." The curate confessed to a sudden uneasiness, as if invisible eyes watched him. "I fear there are fissures in the calm we've long enjoyed here. The Reverend's death has stirred more than grief." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, lighting a cigar, "and the missing items, hat, salver, walking stick, are tokens in a game we have yet to fully comprehend." His mind circled back to Miss Marple. "Her music is more than mere sound. It is a language, a code perhaps, speaking of tension beneath the surface." The next morning brought a summons from the parish council to discuss the recent findings, their thinly veiled concern reflecting a village on the brink of upheaval. Whimsy listened politely as they insisted that the investigation respect the village's reputation and requested discretion. Yet beneath their courteous words lay the unspoken, a desire to protect long-buried family names and the fragile peace maintained by unspoken agreements. Later, Whimsy met privately with Miss Marple in her cottage, seeking to unravel her connection with the Reverend and the whispered bell. She revealed with reluctant candor that Reverend Colic had confided in her his fears, that some among the parish were willing to do anything to prevent truths from emerging. "Secrets," she said quietly, "have a way of poisoning even the purest of springs. The bell tolls not for ghosts, but for justice denied." Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you believe someone wished the Reverend silenced?" "I do," she replied. "But I also believe he was on the verge of discovery, something that threatened the foundation of the village itself." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Mrs. Cattermole entered, her face pale. "There's been another incident at the mill. Footsteps, voices in the night." Whimsy's expression tightened. The mill was no longer a relic but a stage for unfolding drama, its shadows lengthening with every passing hour. That night, under the cloak of darkness, Whimsy and Chivers took their places near the mill, determined to witness the next act in this unfolding mystery. The air was taut with anticipation as the faintest sound, a bell's toll or the echo of one, wafted through the stillness. From the darkness emerged figures, moving cautiously through the ruins, their voices low but urgent. Whimsy recognized one, an unexpected player who had thus far kept to the edges of their investigation. The truth, Whimsy realized, was beginning to call out from the shadows, its cadence slow but inexorable, like the tolling of the ghostly bell itself. The shadows cast by the ruined mill stretched long and distorted beneath the weak light of the waxing moon, the night air thick with a damp chill that seeped through coats and settled deep into the bones. Whimsy crouched silently beside a crumbling wall, his keen eyes adjusting swiftly to the gloom. Beside him, Chivers fidgeted with a handkerchief, his breath visible in the cold, but neither man made a sound. The ruined mill had transformed from a relic of the past into a theater for secrets and suspicion. The faint murmur of voices drifted through the air, careful and hushed. Whimsy's gaze locked on the figures emerging from the darkness. Two men moving with deliberate caution, their heads close together in whispered conference. The first was none other than Mr. Grant, the solicitor who had so conveniently pointed suspicion at the curate and who had seemed far too eager for a quick resolution to the Reverend's death. The second was an unfamiliar man, tall and lean, dressed in a heavy overcoat that rustled softly with each step. Whimsy's mind raced. Why would Mr. Grant be skulking about the mill in the dead of night, accompanied by a stranger? What scheme could they be hatching beneath the ruined roof where only the ghosts of old millers should tread? The men paused near the north wall, the very spot where Whimsy had discovered the loose brick and the hidden note. The unfamiliar figure knelt, producing a small tool from his coat pocket, something long and thin that glinted dully in the moonlight. He set to work on the stone with methodical precision. Whimsy leaned in toward Chivers, whispering, "It appears they seek to disturb what lies concealed beneath the stone." The scrape of metal against masonry was muffled but unmistakable. Time seemed to dilate in the cold night as the two men worked, urgency hidden behind their careful movements. The moment was broken abruptly by a sudden sharp click, the sound of a mechanism releasing. A section of the wall slid inward, revealing a narrow cavity beyond, barely wide enough for a person to slip inside. The unknown man disappeared into the darkness beyond the secret door, while Grant peered inside nervously before following. Whimsy rose quietly, nodding to Chivers to remain still. There was no time to lose. If these men had discovered this hidden passage before the police or the parish council, it meant they were aware of the secret's significance. What was the secret, and what lengths would they go to preserve it? As Whimsy approached the opening, he paused to consider the implications. The tunnel inside was faintly illuminated by a flickering candle held by the figures within. Peering through the gap, he saw a small chamber, roughly hewn but tidy enough to suggest recent use. Scattered across the floor were papers, old ledgers, yellowed letters, and a few photographs bearing the unmistakable visage of the Millward family. A sudden glint caught Whimsy's eye. A small box lying partially open, its contents spilling onto the floor, a collection of keys, some rusted, some clearly newer, along with a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. Whimsy's breath caught. These were no mere relics. These were the implements and documents of someone determined to wield control over the past, and, by extension, the present. He needed to act, but prudence dictated patience. Retreating silently, he conveyed to Chivers the necessity of alerting the authorities with all haste, but cautioned against hasty interruption. Back at the vicarage, the constabulary moved swiftly. The discovery of the secret passageway beneath the mill sent ripples through Witherfold-on-Lint, sparking whispered rumors and stoking old fears. Whimsy convened with the chief constable in the vicar's study, surrounded by stacks of evidence and notes. The presence of those men in the tunnel confirms that we are dealing with a conspiracy reaching beyond the apparent motives. This is not a simple act of personal vengeance, but a struggle for inheritance or influence. The chief frowned. But what exactly is hidden in that chamber, and why has it remained secret for so long? Documents, keys, photographs, suggesting property or family records concealed to manipulate the line of succession or ownership, Whimsy said. It would explain the vicar's obsession with his ancestry and the lengths some have gone to silence him. Meanwhile, Chivers had returned to interrogate Mr. Grant, whose composure showed signs of cracking under discreet but firm questioning. Grant's carefully cultivated veneer of civility began to chip as Whimsy's precise logic tightened the noose. "Mr. Grant," Whimsy said smoothly, "your eagerness to implicate the curate seems less the act of a disinterested solicitor than that of a man keen to divert attention from himself." Grant's lip twitched. "I assure you, Lord Peter, I only seek justice for the Reverend's family." "Justice, yes," Whimsy smiled thinly. "But justice sometimes wears a mask, does it not? Tell me, why were you at the mill that night, and who was your companion?" Under the scrutiny, Grant faltered, his story unraveling. I went to retrieve some papers I thought might exonerate me. No, I mean, to find proof of my innocence. The man with me was an associate, someone I trusted." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "An associate whose identity you conveniently omit, no doubt." Grant hesitated. "His name is Martin Cadell. He handles certain discreet matters." "Discreet indeed," Whimsy muttered under his breath. "A convenient partner in clandestine activity." The revelations gathered momentum. Cadell, as it transpired, was a known fixer, skilled in obscuring inconvenient truths and manipulating evidence. a man with no love for the vicar and vested interests in the outcomes of old wills and land titles. The evidence pieced together suggested that Cadell and Grant had been orchestrating a campaign to conceal facts that the Reverend had uncovered, facts that threatened to upend the carefully balanced social order of Witherfold. Whimsy, ever methodical, began to map the timelines anew, scrutinizing each alibi, each statement for cracks and inconsistencies. The clock in the vicarage, notably slow by several minutes compared to the village standard, suddenly gained new significance as it had been cited repeatedly to establish the time of the murder. Ah, the humble clock, Whimsy mused aloud, which has deceived more witnesses than any cunning criminal. His deduction hinged on the minor discrepancy. Time measured by a clock unsynchronized with others in the village could provide a false frame for the sequence of events, allowing the perpetrator to construct an alibi with surgical precision. He presented his findings to the constable, underscoring how the manipulation of such trivial details could mask malevolence and subterfuge. Meanwhile, the investigation into the curate's movements cleared Mr. Lelliston of suspicion, revealing instead a man beleaguered by fears for his parish and the legacy of his mentor. As the threads began to converge, Whimsy found himself increasingly drawn to the silent figures of Miss Marple, whose music continued to echo like a melancholy motif in the background of this sordid affair. Her connection to the Reverend's secrets and her own restrained sorrow suggested a deeper involvement than mere coincidence. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the persistent mist, Whimsy requested a private audience with Miss Marple in the vicarage drawing-room. The pianist entered quietly, her eyes reflecting the pale light with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. "Miss Marple," Whimsy began, his voice low and deliberate, "you have been an observer and confidant to the late Reverend in these troubling days. What can you tell me of his state of mind in those final hours?" She hesitated, then spoke with a quiet intensity. "He was troubled, Lord Peter. The past had clawed its way into the present, and he feared what it might reveal. He believed that the ghost bell was a warning, a signal that justice, long denied, would soon be demanded." Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. A poetic notion, but one grounded in very real fear. "Yes," she replied. "He played the notes on his piano, like a summons. The melody was a cipher, a plea for understanding, a call to uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Chivers entered with news. The secret chamber beneath the mill had yielded more than just documents. Among the papers was a ledger detailing land transactions and debts, records implicating several prominent villagers in a scheme to dispossess the Millward family and suppress their claims. "The plot thickens," Whimsy said quietly, steepling his fingers. "We are dealing with a web of greed and fear, of inheritance stolen and reputations bought." He paused, looking toward the window where the fading light hinted at dusk. "And yet the question remains. Who struck the fatal blow, and why did they believe silencing the Reverend would preserve their fragile dominion?" The answer, Whimsy knew, lay just beyond the veil of shadows, waiting for the toll of the ghost bell to sound once more. The vicarage seemed to hold its breath as the evening deepened, the dying sun casting long, mournful shadows over the worn carpet and faded wallpaper. Lord Peter Whimsy, seated in the drawing-room, was engaged in a quiet conversation with the village constable, Chivers, and Miss Marple, whose delicate fingers toyed nervously with a silver locket that caught the low light. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken thoughts, the silence punctuated only by the occasional tick of the ancient grandfather clock, whose reliability had suddenly become a matter of grave interest. Whimsy's gaze, thoughtful and intent, rested momentarily on the piano, a battered old Steinway, its ebony surface dull with years of melancholy touch. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "you mentioned the Reverend's last composition was a sort of cipher. I find that notion irresistible. Might I trouble you to play it once more?" The very notes, the rhythm, the cadence, they may reveal more than words alone. She hesitated, eyes downcast, then nodded. Her slender fingers lifted, hovering over the keys for a moment as if drawing strength from the silence before releasing a haunting melody into the room. The music was sparse, deliberate, notes interspersed with sudden rests, a pattern emerging as if a message were hidden within the melody's ebb and flow. Wimsey listened, his mind assembling fragments of thought like pieces in a great, intricate jigsaw. As the final note faded, he leaned forward. There, in that pause between the second and third bars, does that not feel like a marker? An intentional break, perhaps, to draw attention to what is unsaid? Miss Marple nodded. The Reverend spoke of gaps, things left out of the ledger, details omitted from the parish records. Wimsey's eyes twinkled with a spark of discovery. Omissions, indeed. Let us then turn to the ledger found beneath the mill. If the Reverend's melody was a plea to uncover hidden truths, this ledger might be the key to understanding what was deliberately obscured. Chivers placed a bundle of papers on the table. The ledger was old, its pages brittle but meticulously kept. Entries detailed land transactions, debts and payments, an ordinary enough affair on the surface. Yet Wimsey's practiced eye soon detected inconsistencies. Dates that overlapped impossibly, figures that failed to tally, names conspicuously absent. Here, Wimsey said, pointing to an entry dated just 3 weeks prior to the Reverend's death. Notice the transfer of property from the Millward estate to one Reginald Grant, solicitor, and, curiously, a man who has shown great interest in this investigation. Chivers whistled softly. So the plot thickens. Grant's motive is financial after all. Financial and social, Wimsey corrected. Control of land in a village like Witherfield is not merely about ownership, but influence. Removing the Millward presence would ensure a monopoly of power. The clock chimed suddenly, a sonorous sound that seemed too formal for such a dismal subject. Wimsey's eyes flicked toward the window, where the first stars had begun to prick the navy-blue canvas of the sky. "We must examine who else might benefit from the Reverend's silence," Wimsey said. "The ledger hints at collusion, but collusion demands more than one accomplice." He turned to Miss Marple. "Have you noticed anyone in the village acting unusually? Unusually nervous or overly curious?" She bit her lip. "There is Mrs. Farncombe, the rector's widow. Since the Reverend's death, she has been uncharacteristically reclusive. Yet when I visited her yesterday, I caught a glimpse of papers hastily hidden behind a Bible." "An evasive hand betrays much," Wimsey remarked. "I shall pay Mrs. Farncombe a visit on the morrow." Chivers, ever the pragmatist, shifted uneasily. But what of the timing? The murder occurred just as the ghost bell was meant to toll, and the curate's alibi seems airtight. Where does the physical act of violence fit? Wimsey smiled thinly. "Ah, timing. The enemy of many a criminal. Recall our earlier discussion of clocks and the deliberate unsynchronization of the vicarage clock. The error in timekeeping provided a deceptive framework to obscure the murderer's movements." He rose, pacing slowly. The victim's body was found at precisely 8:15 p.m., according to village time. Yet the vicarage clock lagged by 7 minutes, meaning the attack may have occurred earlier or later than suspected. Chivers frowned. So the murderer could have struck before the curate's alibi began. Precisely. And this subtle temporal distortion is key. Wimsey returned to his chair and tapped the ledger thoughtfully. If only the curate had been more than a figure of convenience. A scapegoat, perhaps? Then this confusion of time would have sufficed. He paused, tapping a slender finger against his chin. And yet, despite the evidence, there remains something elusive, a detail we have overlooked, or one deliberately hidden. The following morning dawned grey and cold, the village cloaked in a mist that seemed to seep from the very soil. Wimsey made his way to the Farncombe estate, a modest but dignified house perched on the edge of Witherfield's small green. Mrs. Farncombe received him with a guarded civility, her eyes shadowed by grief and perhaps fear. "You wish to see me, Lord Peter?" she asked, voice soft but wary. "Indeed, madam," Wimsey replied with courteous warmth. "The late Reverend was a man of mystery, and mysteries have a habit of lingering beyond the grave." He observed her closely as she led him into the parlor, where heavy curtains muffled the outside light. "I understand you have papers that might shed light on these troubling events." Mrs. Farncombe's fingers trembled slightly as she reached behind a stack of hymnals and retrieved a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These were his private correspondences," she said. "He entrusted them to me in the hope that they might be preserved." Wimsey accepted the letters reverently, noting the familiar handwriting on the seals. As he carefully untied the ribbon, Mrs. Farncombe's gaze wavered. The Reverend was troubled by the village's past, the land disputes, the old family feuds. He believed that some of Witherfold's darkest secrets were concealed in plain sight. One letter in particular caught Wimsey's eye. An unsigned note, its script elegant but hurried. It spoke cryptically of debts unpaid and the tolling bell that would mark reckoning for those who had wronged the Millwood family. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Wimsey asked. She shook her head. "No, but the message is chilling. It arrived shortly before the Reverend's death." Wimsey's mind worked swiftly. "This letter implies a threat, a warning. And yet," Mrs. Farncombe added, "he did not share its full meaning with me. He feared it might only invite danger." As Wimsey absorbed this, Kivers appeared, having secured a statement from a local clockmaker. "Lord Peter, the clockmaker, confirms that the vicarage clock was deliberately adjusted by an expert, someone who understood the mechanism well enough to slow it by precisely 7 minutes. An act of premeditated deception," Wimsey noted, "and given the clock's central role in the village's timekeeping, it was the perfect cover." He turned back to Mrs. Farncombe. Who would benefit from such precision in deception? Her lips parted in a faint, bitter smile. "Only those desperate enough to manipulate not only property, but truth itself." The puzzle pieces gathered momentum, weaving a tapestry of intrigue, betrayal, and carefully orchestrated deceit. Wimsey sensed the final act drawing near, the moment when the veil would lift to reveal the puppeteer behind this macabre drama. Yet, as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the village bell began to toll, not the ghostly chime of legend, but the steady, solemn peal of reality, Wimsey knew that the truth would be stranger and far more human than any whispered superstition. And somewhere within Witherfold's narrow lanes and silent corners, the murderer watched and waited, certain that the shadows still concealed their secret. The village bell's steady toll lingered in the cool evening air, casting a rhythmic pulse over the quiet streets of Witherfold. Lord Peter Wimsey stood by the drawing-room window, watching the smoke curl from chimneys into a twilight sky veined with purple and gold. The revelations of the day had lifted some veils, but as always, the deeper truth remained just out of reach. The quiet creak of the door alerted him to Miss Mardle's presence once again. Her face bore the delicate tension of someone holding secrets close to her heart. "Lord Peter," she began softly, "there is one matter I hesitated to speak of until now. It concerns the Reverend's behavior in the days before his death." Wimsey turned, attentive. "Go on." "After he received the unsigned letter, the one you found among Mrs. Farncombe's papers, the Reverend became withdrawn. More than that, he began to revisit his past more intensely, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had haunted his family for generations." Wimsey nodded slowly. The ledger beneath the mill, the letters, the clock's altered timing, all threads in the same tangled web. She hesitated, then confessed, "He confided in me once that he had discovered evidence of a forgery in the parish records, documents altered to conceal an illegitimate claim on the Millwood estate." "Forgery?" Whimsy's eyes gleamed with renewed interest. That would explain the urgency behind his investigation and the motive for murder. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. He feared that the forger was still among us and that confronting this truth might unravel the fabric of the village's peace. Whimsy's mind raced. The documents beneath the mill, the tempered clock, the shadowy figure of Martin Cadell, all signs pointed toward an orchestrated effort to protect that secret. "We must act quickly," he said. "Any more delay could mean losing vital evidence or allowing the perpetrator to escape justice." At that moment, Chivers entered, a grim expression etched on his face. "Lord Peter, we have news. The police have detained Martin Cadell at a nearby inn. He was caught attempting to leave the village under cover of darkness." "Good," Whimsy said quietly. "And what of Grant?" "Still at large, but we have a warrant. He was seen meeting with Cadell only hours before the arrest." The pieces were falling swiftly into place. "We must interrogate Cadell immediately. His cooperation could illuminate the final mysteries." The interrogation took place in the dim confines of the village police office, the air thick with tension. Cadell, calm and unrepentant, met Whimsy's sharp gaze with a defiant smirk. "You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy," he said smoothly, "but you're only chasing shadows." Whimsy replied, "Tell me, Cadell, what were you and Grant doing at the mill the night of the murder? And what do you know of the forged documents?" Cadell's eyes flickered briefly, betraying a flicker of uncertainty before he masked it. "We were retrieving some papers Grant claimed would protect his interests. As for the forgery, let's say it's a matter of keeping certain families in their place. The mill wards were always a threat." "And the vicar?" Whimsy pressed. "Why silence him?" "Because he found out too much. He threatened to expose the truth, disrupt the status quo. That wouldn't do for some." Whimsy's pulse quickened. "And the altered clock? The misleading alibi?" Cadell shrugged. "All part of the plan. We needed a cover story to divert suspicion." With that, the facade cracked. Cadell's confession, while incomplete, confirmed the conspiracy entwining Witherfold's social fabric with greed and fear. But one question gnawed at Whimsy. What of the final act? Who dealt the fatal blow? Was it you? Cadell's smirk faltered. "You think I'm a murderer? Number, I'm a cleaner. I make problems disappear. Quietly. The killing was done by someone else. Someone with more to lose." Whimsy leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Then who?" The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock, the very clock that had played such a pivotal role in this deadly drama. Outside, the village settled under the darkening sky, but inside, the truth was drawing closer, the next revelation imminent, and the shadow of the ghost bell growing ever more insistent. The room in which Lord Peter Whimsy sat was dimly lit by a single lamp, its glow casting long shadows that seemed to dance against the peeling wallpaper, a quiet stage upon which the final acts of this intricate drama would unfold. Martin Cadell's words still hung in the air like a slow fog, heavy with implication. He was not the murderer. Someone else had struck the fatal blow, and that someone had far more to lose than he did. Whimsy's eyes narrowed, a familiar sparkle igniting behind his spectacles. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, considering the strands he had gathered. The forged documents hinted at a deep-rooted secret, one tied not only to property, but to lineage, reputation, and power. The meticulous manipulation of time by tampering with the vicarage clock was no mere diversion. It was a statement that those who held the village's fate in their hands were prepared to bend truth and reality alike to preserve their dominion. "Cadell," Whimsy began slowly, "you say the killing was committed by someone else. You, as you put it, are the cleaner. You help problems disappear, yes? But you cannot hide everything." The convict's jaw tightened. "I keep my own hands clean of murder." "Yet you're complicit in the deception," Whimsy said, voice low but incisive. It would seem you are willing to facilitate the concealment of a crime to protect your benefactor." Cadell's expression flickered, but he said nothing. "Now," Whimsy continued, "consider this. Who would have the knowledge to manipulate the clock so precisely? Who had access to the Reverend and the ability to monitor his movements?" The convict shrugged. "Ask Grant. He's the one who arranged most of it." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Grant, yes, the solicitor with much to gain. But someone had to act more intimately within the household. Someone familiar enough with the vicarage to adjust the clock, to manage the servants' movements, and to ensure no one noticed." He paused, then said, "Mrs. Farncombe, the widow, does she fit into this picture?" Cadell's gaze darkened. "She knows more than she lets on, perhaps too much." Whimsy rose, pacing the small room. "She has been reclusive, defensive. But what if that was because she was guarding a secret that involved not just inheritance, but the very fabric of the village's history?" The detective's thoughts turned to Miss Mardle's revelation of the Reverend's fear of exposing the forged parish records. The ledger beneath the mill, the mysterious letters, the letter threatening reckoning, all suggested that the Reverend had been close to unraveling a deceit that would shake Witherfold to its core. "And the final question," Whimsy said, turning sharply to Cadell. "Who struck the blow? Who silenced the Reverend forever?" Cadell's voice was low, grudging. "If you want the truth, it's the last person anyone would suspect." Whimsy gestured for silence. "I am all ears." Cadell hesitated, then muttered, "The Reverend's own curate, Jonathan Blake." Whimsy's brow furrowed. The curate had been a figure of steadfast alibis and sober demeanor, seemingly incapable of violence. Yet the pieces shifted subtly when Cadell mentioned him. Blake? And why would he do it? A tangled web of jealousy, fear, and loyalty, Cadell replied grimly. He loved the Reverend, yes, but also feared what the truth would do to the village and to his own future. Whimsy considered the psychological layers. Blake's devotion twisted by dread of ruin, the curate's carefully constructed alibi now less certain given the clock's manipulation. The victim's last days had been shadowed not only by threats, but by personal betrayal. "Very well," Whimsy said, rising with a decisive air. "We must confront the curate. The final act must be played on his stage." The next morning, a chill wind rustled the trees surrounding the vicarage as Whimsy and Chivers made their way along the narrow lane to the curate's modest lodgings. Jonathan Blake greeted them with a composed, almost serene expression, though his hands betrayed a slight tremor. Whimsy wasted no time. "Mr. Blake, it appears you have been living a lie." Blake's eyes darkened. "I have done what was necessary to protect the Reverend's legacy and the village's stability." "Protect or control?" Whimsy challenged gently. "You feared exposure of the forged documents that, if revealed, would have toppled many reputations and threatened your own standing. You chose to silence the Reverend rather than face the consequences." Blake's calm facade cracked. "He was my mentor, my guide. When the truth threatened to destroy everything, I could not bear it. I confronted him that night. Things escalated beyond control." "And the clock?" Whimsy asked. "The 7 minutes gained by altering its mechanism?" "An attempt to cover my tracks," Blake admitted quietly. "I did not anticipate the complexity of the web I was caught in." "Yet the timing was your undoing," Whimsy observed. "The discrepancy between the clock's true time and village time allowed suspicion to fall elsewhere." Blake bowed his head. "I cannot deny it. The weight of my actions crushes me." Whimsy regarded the man with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Justice must be served, but your confession brings clarity." Outside, the village bell tolled solemnly, a final note that echoed through Witherfold's narrow streets and quiet houses. The mystery was laid bare. Not a tale of ghosts or superstition, but one of human frailty, fear, and the desperate attempts to protect fragile reputations at any cost. Returning to the vicarage, Wimsey reflected on the intricate dance of deceit he had unraveled. The forged ledger, the tampered clock, the letter of warning, and the carefully concealed psychological torment had combined to produce tragedy. And through it all, the village, so outwardly serene, had concealed a nest of secrets and lies. As he prepared to leave Witherfold, Wimsey allowed himself a rare smile. It is, after all, as Shakespeare wrote, "The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones." Though, I dare say, it is the good men like the Reverend who pay the highest price. Chivers looked on with quiet admiration, and Miss Marple, standing in the doorway, gave a soft nod of gratitude. Wimsey lit his cigar, the smoke curling in the fading light, and with a final glance back at the village that had momentarily disturbed his usual equanimity, he stepped into the evening, ready for the next puzzle fate might present. For now, the ghost bell was silent. Under the waning light of a sombre afternoon, Lord Peter Wimsey gathered the principal players in the drawing-room of the vicarage, a modest chamber now charged with the weight of revelation. The curtains were drawn taut against the encroaching dusk, the only illumination a flickering fire whose shadows flicked nervously against the aged walls. There, in the company of Miss Marple, Chivers, Martin Cadell, Mrs. Farncombe, and the humbled Jonathan Blake, Wimsey prepared to lay bare the tangled skein of deceit. He began with a delicate arch of his brow, his voice low and measured, the quintessential blend of wit and gravity that bespoke his mastery. "Ladies and gentlemen, the mystery that has vexed Witherfold, this ghastly business of the ghost bell and the murdered reverend, rests not on supernatural whimsy but on the all-too-human foibles of fear, jealousy, and preservation of reputation." He paused, allowing the gathered company to absorb the inevitable, before continuing. The Reverend's discovery of the forged parish records threatened a lineage long protected by artifice. It was a secret so potent that some deemed it better buried than revealed, for the upheaval would have shaken not only estates, but the very standing of certain families in this village. Wimsey's gaze settled on Mrs. Farncombe, whose steely composure faltered just so. The late Reverend, God rest him, was methodically unraveling this deception, aided unwittingly by a series of subtle clues: the misplaced ledger beneath the mill, the altered letters, and, yes, the tampering of the vicarage clock, which was more than a mere mechanical aberration. It was a calculated attempt to mislead, to manufacture an alibi. Turning to Cadell, Wimsey continued, "Mr. Cadell, your role as the cleaner was clear. You were the instrument, if not the originator, of the subterfuge. Yet it was not you who delivered the fatal blow, as you have conceded." "And the murderer?" Miss Marple's voice trembled slightly. "Jonathan Blake," Wimsey said with quiet finality, "the Reverend's curate, whose love for his mentor became a prison wrought of dread and desperation. Faced with the collapse of the world he cherished, he silenced the voice that threatened it." Blake, pale but composed, nodded slowly. "It is true. I feared the ruin that exposure would bring, not only to the village but to my own soul. I did what I thought necessary." Wimsey inclined his head. A tragic calculus, indeed. He concluded, "Thus the so-called ghost bell was but the echo of human failing, the chime of secrets long buried yet never forgotten. The clock's minutes gained, the forged documents, the threatening letter, all pieces in a mosaic of fear and silence. With that, the silence deepened. Mrs. Farncombe's eyes glistened. Miss Marple wiped a tear discreetly, and Cadell's shoulders sagged with relief and resignation. Wimsey's smile was faint but unmistakable. And so, justice, tempered with understanding, has been served. Though one might ponder, as Shakespeare so aptly put it, that the evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones. He lit a final cigar, the smoke curling upward like a benediction, and, with a courteous bow to the assembly, he took his leave. The shadows of Witherfold lengthened once more, but now the village could rest in the honest stillness that follows truth's unveiling. Outside, the church bell tolled, not in warning, but as a solemn hymn to the end of a tale both Gothic and profoundly human, told in the inimitable manner of Lord Peter Wimsey.